Fleet Commander Veth'nar stunned a detachment that had earned him his position in the Thessian Collective's military hierarchy. 47 ships arranged in defensive formation around a convoy of refugee transports, 6 species contributing assets to the Coalition Defense Initiative. A textbook protection operation. The mathematics were acceptable. All fleet elements report ready status, his communications officer announced. Coalition Defense Fleet is at full operational capacity. Veth'nar acknowledged with a slight inclination of his head, his silver-gray scales catching the blue light of the command displays. The Thessian Collective had contributed the flagship, the Harmonious Consensus, along with 7 cruisers. The Valari had provided 12 destroyers. The Ketharani brought their carrier group. Even the more Vathi, typically isolationist, had sent 4 heavy frigates. And the humans. Vethnar's eyes drifted to the smallest blip on the tactical display. The ESS Defiant, a human carrier barely larger than a Thessian destroyer, holding position at the fleet's edge. Its contribution to the defense operation, 12 fighters. 12 fighters. The humans had sent 12 fighters to defend a convoy of 40,000 refugees. Commander, his tactical officer said, the human squadron is requesting permission to run patrol sweeps ahead of the convoy. Denied. They will hold formation with the fleet. Veth'nar didn't bother explaining his reasoning. Human fighters were fast, and their pilots were skilled, but in a fleet engagement they were negligible assets. Their weapons couldn't penetrate capital ship shields. Their armor couldn't withstand a single direct hit. They were, in the cold calculus of military mathematics, expendable. He pulled up the human squadron roster out of professional courtesy. 12 pilots, led by Squadron Commander Luna Starflare. Her service record was impressive for a human. Multiple engagement ribbons, a citation for exceptional piloting during the Kepler Station incident, and a reputation for remaining calm under pressure. Competent for a species that had only achieved spaceflight 2 centuries ago. But competence in a fighter meant nothing when the enemy brought dreadnoughts. "Commander!" His sensor officer's voice cut through the bridge's ambient hum. Hyperspace signatures detected. Multiple contacts emerging at coordinates 77 Mark III. The tactical display shifted, and Veth'nar felt his scales tighten involuntarily. Ships, dozens of them. Dropping out of hyperspace in perfect formation, their hulls bearing the angular crimson markings of the Dominion hegemony. "Count," Veth'nar ordered, his voice steady despite the cold spreading through his thorax. 42, 56, 73 combat vessels, Commander." The sensor officer paused, her mandibles clicking with distress. "And 1 Dreadnought-class signature, Dominion flagship, Inevitable Victory." The bridge fell silent. Veth'nar stared at the display as the Dreadnought's signature resolved into full detail. 3 kilometers of armored hull, enough firepower to crack a planetary shield. Fighter bays carrying 200 combat craft. The Inevitable Victory alone outgunned half his fleet. 73 against 47, his tactical officer murmured. "And that's before accounting for the Dreadnought." "I can count, Lieutenant." Vethnar's voice carried an edge he rarely permitted himself. He was already running calculations, weighing options, preparing the consensus queries he would need to send to the other species commanders. The Thessian way was deliberation, analysis, collective decision-making that minimized individual error. It had served them well for 10,000 years of interstellar civilization. But mathematics did not lie. The refugee convoy carried 40,000 civilians, Ketharani families fleeing a conquered homeworld, elderly, children, non-combatants who had already lost everything except their lives. Lives that now depended on 47 ships facing impossible odds. "Open channel to Squadron Commander Starflare," Veth'nar said. He wasn't certain why. Perhaps he wanted to assess the humans' reaction to the situation. Perhaps he simply wanted to confirm that humans understood the mathematics as well as Thessians did. The channel crackled, and a calm female voice responded. "Starflare here. We see them, Commander." "Your assessment, Squadron Commander?" A brief pause. When Starflare spoke again, her voice carried no fear, no bravado. Just the flat, professional tone of someone stating facts. "Bad odds, sir. Request permission to launch and establish forward reconnaissance." Denied. Hold formation. Veth'nar studied the tactical display, watching the Dominion fleet begin its approach. "This engagement will be decided by capital ships, Squadron Commander. Your fighters are—" He stopped himself before saying irrelevant. "Understood, Commander," Starflare replied. If she noticed his hesitation, she didn't acknowledge it. Holding formation, Starflare out. The channel closed, and Veth'nar returned his attention to the approaching fleet. The Dominion ships were moving into attack formation, the Dreadnought positioning itself at the center of their line. 40,000 refugees, 47 defenders, 73 attackers plus a Dreadnought. The mathematics were no longer acceptable. The mathematics were catastrophic. "Begin fleet-wide tactical assessment," Veth'nar ordered. "I want consensus recommendations from all species commanders within 10 minutes." He didn't say what they would be deciding. He didn't need to. The battle lasted 11 minutes before Veth'nar knew they would lose. The Dominion fleet had engaged with textbook precision, their cruisers forming a killing arc while the Dreadnought hung back, its main batteries picking off coalition ships with contemptuous ease. The harmonious consensus shuddered as another salvo impacted their shields, and Veth'nar gripped his command chair as damage reports flooded the tactical network. Velarii destroyer Swift Current has lost main power. They're requesting emergency assistance. Ketharani Carrier Sanctuary reports fighter bay breach. They've lost half their combat craft. Morvathi frigate Stone Resolve is no longer responding to hails. Veth'nar processed each report with the cold efficiency his training demanded. 4 ships lost in 11 minutes, 7 more critically damaged. The Dominion had lost 2 destroyers, acceptable losses for an engagement they were winning decisively. "Commander," his communications officer said, "the species representatives are requesting an emergency consensus conference. Connect them." The holographic display flickered, and 5 faces appeared, the commanders of each species contingent. Veth'nar saw the same calculation in every expression, the same mathematics playing out behind different eyes. Admiral Kethvar of the Ketharani spoke first, her bioluminescent markings pulsing with distress. "We cannot hold this position. The Dreadnought alone is destroying our formation." "Agreed," rumbled Commander Dreth of the Morvathi, his stone-like features grim. "We have lost 1 frigate, and will lose another within minutes. This engagement is not survivable." One by one they spoke. The Velarii commander, the representative from the YTH consortium, each reaching the same conclusion through their own species, decision-making framework. The mathematics were clear. "Then we are in consensus," Veth'nar said. "The fleet will execute emergency withdrawal, Rally Point 7. "And the convoy?" Admiral Kethvar's voice carried a tremor. The refugees were her people, Ketharani families. Veth'nar paused for precisely 1 second. "The convoy cannot achieve hyperspace velocity before the Dominion intercepts them. If we remain to defend them, we lose the fleet and the convoy. If we withdraw, we preserve military assets for future operations. We condemn 40,000 civilians to death or enslavement." "Yes," Veth'nar held her gaze, "we do." Silence on the conference channel. Then, one by one, the commanders signaled their assent. Admiral Kethvar was last, her luminescence dimming to almost nothing as she authorized the abandonment of her own people. "We fight by consensus," Veth'nar thought. "We retreat by consensus." The mathematics were clear. He closed the conference channel and opened fleet-wide communications. "All coalition vessels, this is Fleet Commander Veth'nar. Execute emergency hyperspace jump to rally point 7. Repeat. All ships withdraw immediately. The responses came quickly. Acknowledgements from Thessian, Valari, Kethrani, Morvathi vessels. Engines spinning up across the fleet as ships prepared to abandon the convoy they had sworn to protect. Then the human carrier responded. Coalition Command, this is ESS Defiant, acknowledging withdrawal order. Captain Chen's voice was steady, professional, requesting clarification on convoy protection during retreat. Veth'nar felt a flash of irritation. The convoy cannot be protected, Defiant. Execute withdrawal. Understood, Command. And our deployed fighters? Recall them. Your squadron is to dock immediately and prepare for hyperspace jump. A brief pause. Then a different voice came over the channel, calm, female, utterly without inflection. Coalition Command, this is Starflare. Request clarification. Vethnar's scales tightened. Clarification on what, Squadron Commander? Confirm you are ordering full fleet withdrawal with the convoy still in the engagement zone. Confirmed. The convoy cannot be saved. Your fighters cannot stop a Dreadnought. Another pause. When Starflare spoke again, her voice remained exactly the same. No anger, no accusation, just a pilot confirming her orders. Commander, confirm you're ordering us to abandon 40,000 civilians. Vethnar's irritation flared into something sharper. He was trying to save what could be saved, and this human was questioning the consensus of 6 species commanders. Starflare, your fighters are not relevant to this engagement. The enemy Dreadnought alone outguns your entire squadron by a factor of 1,000. Fall back to your carrier. That is a direct order. Acknowledged, Commander. Something in her tone. Veth'nar couldn't identify it. Not defiance. Her voice was too flat for defiance. Not fear. He'd heard enough frightened pilots to recognize that. Something else. Something he didn't have a framework to understand. He dismissed it. Humans were emotional creatures. Perhaps this was how they processed difficult orders. All fighters, return to carrier immediately. Starflare's voice continued over the squadron channel. Prepare for emergency docking procedures. Veth'nar turned his attention back to the tactical display. Coalition ships were beginning to jump, flashes of light marking their escape from the engagement zone. The Dominion fleet wasn't pursuing. Why would they? They had what they wanted. The convoy, defenseless. On his display, he watched the human fighters break formation and begin moving toward their carrier. All except one. One signature was accelerating, but not toward the Defiant, not toward the rally point. Toward the Dominion fleet. Sensor officer, Veth'nar said slowly, identify that fighter. Coalition registry, human fighter, designation Starflare 1. The officer's voice carried confusion. Commander, she's not retreating. She's moving to attack speed. Veth'nar stared at the display. One fighter. Accelerating towards 73 enemy ships and a Dreadnought. Open channel to Starflare, he ordered. The channel crackled. When the human spoke, her voice was exactly as calm as it had been 30 seconds ago. Coalition Command, this is Starflare, negative on retreat order. Engaging enemy flagship. Starflare, you will stand down immediately. Vethnar's voice carried the full authority of the Thessian Collective's military command structure. It was the voice that had coordinated fleet actions across 3-star systems, that had brought 6 species into unified defensive operations, that had never, in his entire career, been disobeyed. Negative, Commander. The same calm tone, the same flat inflection, as if she were declining a second cup of stimulant rather than defying a direct order in the middle of combat. On the tactical display, Starflare 1 continued accelerating toward the Dominion fleet, a single blue signature against a wall of red. Squadron Commander Starflare, you are under Coalition Command authority. I am ordering you to break off and return to your carrier. "Respectfully, Commander, I'm not under Coalition command." Her voice never changed. Not faster, not louder, just calm. "I'm operating under Earth Defense Directive 7. Protection of civilian lives takes precedence over tactical withdrawal. And Earth doesn't abandon civilians." Vethnar's claws dug into his command chair. "Your directive is irrelevant. You cannot stop a Dreadnought with a single fighter. You will die for nothing." "Maybe," a brief pause, "but 40,000 people, Commander, that's not mathematics, that's the job." The channel crackled with other voices, human voices. Luna's squadron, still moving toward the carrier but flooding the communications frequency. "Starflare, this is Phoenix 2. I'm coming with you." "Negative, Phoenix. Hold formation." "Luna, you can't." I said negative. For the first time, something entered her voice. Not fear, not anger. "Command. Get the squadron to the carrier. Protect their retreat. That's an order." "You're ordering us to leave you." "I'm ordering you to do your job." 11 fighters can screen the Defiant until they jump. 1 fighter can't. A pause. "But 1 fighter can be a distraction. Now fall back." That's final. Silence on the human channel. Then, one by one, acknowledgments, reluctant, angry, but obedient. Veth'nar watched the 11 blue signatures continue toward the carrier, while Starflare 1 pulled further ahead, accelerating to attack speed. 1 fighter. She was attacking a Dreadnought with 1 fighter. "Commander," his sensor officer's voice was hushed. "Dominion point defense systems are tracking her approach." They're not deploying fighters to intercept." "Why would they?" Veth'nar replied bitterly. 1 fighter is beneath their notice." But he couldn't look away from the display. Around him, Coalition ships continued jumping to hyperspace. Flashes of light marking their escape, their survival, their abandonment of the convoy. The Valari destroyers went first, then the Morvathi frigates. The Kethrani carrier jumped with Admiral Kethvar still on the command channel, her bioluminescence completely dark as she watched her people's death sentence execute. Soon only the Harmonious Consensus remained, its hyperspace drives spinning up for emergency jump. And 1 human fighter now entering weapons range of the Dominion Dreadnought. In her cockpit, Luna Starflare breathed. In, 4 counts. Hold, 4 counts. Out, 4 counts. Her helmet display painted the tactical situation in clean lines and vectors. The Dreadnought filled her forward view, 3 kilometers of angular death bristling with weapons. Around it, the Dominion fleet maintained formation, their attention on the retreating Coalition ships. She wasn't thinking about dying. Death wasn't useful data. She was thinking about approach vectors, shield harmonics. The thermal exhaust patterns she'd studied in intelligence briefings that no one else had bothered to read because no one else had planned to get this close. Her fighter's computer flagged incoming fire point defense systems activating along the Dreadnought's port side. Thousands of rounds per second, filling the space between her and the target with lethal metal. Luna's hands moved on the controls, micro-adjustments. Instinct and training merging into something that didn't require conscious thought. The first salvo missed by 12 meters. She adjusted. The second salvo missed by 8. She adjusted again. "Coalition Command," she said, her voice unchanged despite the violence erupting around her. "This is Starflare, beginning attack run on enemy flagship." Through the static, Vethnar's voice, "Starflare, you cannot." "Recommend you complete your jump, Commander. This frequency is about to get busy." She killed the channel. The Dreadnought's point defense intensified, tracking algorithms trying to predict her vector. But Luna wasn't flying patterns they could predict. She wasn't flying patterns at all. She was flying like she'd learned in Earth's atmosphere, reacting, adapting, treating every moment as a new equation to solve, rather than a trajectory to follow. Behind her, the Harmonious Consensus jumped to hyperspace, taking Commander Veth'nar and his disbelief with it. Ahead, The Dreadnought filled the universe. Luna smiled slightly, not with joy, not with fear, with focus. "All right," she murmured to herself. "Let's see what you've got." She dove into the fire. Gunner First Class Keth Varan had served on the inevitable victory for 6 years. He had participated in the subjugation of 3 species, the destruction of 14 enemy capital ships, and countless smaller engagements. His targeting accuracy was in the 97th percentile of all Dominion gunners. He could not hit this fighter. Tracking solution failed. His console announced for the 12th time in 30 seconds. Recalculating. The human craft screamed across his targeting display, a blur of motion that refused to follow any pattern his computer could predict. He fired another burst, 2,000 rounds per second of magnetically accelerated death, and watched the fighter dance through the gaps like the projectiles weren't there. "Section 7, report!" The voice of Weapons Commander Drethkal cut through the battery channel. "Why is that fighter still flying?" "Commander, the targeting computer can't predict her next move." Keth Varan's claws trembled on his controls. "She's not flying any recognized pattern. Her vectors they're random." "Then predict it yourself, Gunner. Use your instincts." Keth Varan stared at his display, watching the human fighter execute a rolling turn that should have torn the craft apart. "Sir, I don't think she knows her next move." Silence on the channel. 17 light minutes away, at Rally Point 7, Fleet Commander Veth'nar stood before a long-range sensor display and watched the impossible unfold. The harmonious consensus had jumped to safety. His fleet was regrouping. The tactical situation was stabilizing. But he couldn't stop watching the single blue signature still moving through the Dominion formation. She should have been dead within seconds. Point defense systems on a Dominion Dreadnought could track and destroy fighters at distances of 50 kilometers, filling space with so much fire that survival was mathematically impossible. The human had been under fire for 3 minutes. She was still flying. "Commander," his tactical officer said quietly, "how is she doing that?" Veth'nar didn't answer immediately. He was accessing the Coalition database, pulling files he'd never bothered to read, human pilot training protocols, Earth atmospheric flight certification requirements, combat readiness assessments. What he found made his scales tighten. "Earth's atmosphere," he said slowly. "They train in Earth's atmosphere." "Sir?" "Most species develop spaceflight and then teach their pilots to fly." Vethnar's eyes remained fixed on the display. "Predictable physics, vacuum conditions, smooth trajectories calculated by computer and executed by pilot. Space is mathematics." On the display, the human fighter corkscrewed through another wall of point defense fire, missing destruction by meters. "But humans learn to fly in atmosphere first. Earth's atmosphere. Do you know what Earth's atmosphere is like?" His tactical officer shook her head. "Turbulent, unpredictable, violent weather systems that can shear a wing off without warning, crosswinds that change direction mid-flight, thermal columns that spike and drop faster than computer models can predict." Veth'nar pulled up the data. "Human pilots don't learn to fly patterns. They learn to react. Constant micro-adjustments, thousands per minute, responding to variables they can't predict, because the variables change faster than conscious thought. They fly by instinct. They fly by trained chaos. Their reflexes become so ingrained that conscious thought isn't part of the process. They don't decide to evade. They evade before their brain registers the threat." Veth'nar watched another impossible maneuver. "Space combat for us is mathematics. For them, it's a thunderstorm they grew up in." On the Dreadnought's hull, the point defense batteries were reaching their thermal limits. Luna didn't know this. She didn't need to. She was operating below conscious thought. Now, her body and her ship merged into a single system that responded to threats before she could name them. Roll left. A stream of tracers passed through the space she'd occupied a millisecond before. Dive. A targeting laser swept over her canopy, finding nothing. Climb and spin. 2 converging fire patterns intersected behind her. their gunners having predicted where she should have been rather than where she was. She flew like the universe was trying to kill her, and she simply didn't care. Earth's atmosphere wasn't just where humans learned to fly. It was where they learned that flying meant fighting for every meter, that the sky wasn't empty, it was hostile, active, constantly trying to drag you down or tear you apart. You didn't fly through Earth's air, you negotiated with it, you fought it. You earned every second of altitude with reflexes and instinct, and the bone-deep knowledge that hesitation meant death. Space was supposed to be easier, predictable physics, no weather, clean trajectories. But Luna had never learned to fly clean trajectories. She'd learned to fly through chaos, and chaos, it turned out, was what she needed right now. The point defense fire was thinning. She was too close now, inside the optimal engagement range, where the tracking systems couldn't traverse fast enough to follow her movements. The Dreadnought's hull filled her canopy, gray metal and weapons emplacements and maintenance ports. She was through. Her fighters skimmed the surface of the inevitable victory, close enough that she could see individual armor plates. The point defense guns couldn't depress far enough to target her. For these few precious seconds, she was in the one place they couldn't reach. Luna allowed herself a single breath. Then she began looking for what she'd come to find. The Dreadnought's surface was a landscape of metal and death. Luna skimmed 30 meters above the hull, her fighter's belly almost close enough to scrape paint. At this range, she could see details that sensor scans never captured: maintenance hatches, coolant vents, the scorch marks from decades of combat. The inevitable victory was old, she realized, battle-scarred, a veteran of countless engagements. She intended to make this its last. Behind her, the point defense batteries were trying to reorient, their tracking systems screaming errors as they attempted to target something flying below their minimum elevation. A few guns managed to fire, but the angles were wrong, rounds sparking off the Dreadnought's own armor rather than finding her. Luna wasn't paying attention to them. She was reading the ship. Every vessel had a rhythm, power conduits that pulsed with energy, heat signatures that revealed internal systems, structural patterns that told you where the engineers had reinforced and where they'd cut corners. Luna had studied Dominion ship designs for 3 years, memorizing schematics that her commanders said were interesting but tactically irrelevant. No fighter could threaten a Dreadnought, they'd said. No fighter was supposed to get this close, Luna had thought, but what if one did? Her eyes tracked across the hull, cataloging and dismissing. Weapons batteries, hardened, redundant, irrelevant. Shield generators, too distributed to matter. Communications arrays, symbolic value only. There. Thermal exhaust ports, 3 of them, spaced along the Dreadnought's dorsal ridge, venting waste heat from the main reactor, standard Dominion design. The ports were shielded against external weapons fire, angled so that direct hits were geometrically impossible. From outside the ship, Luna's mind was quiet, calm, running calculations without conscious effort, the same way her hands made micro-adjustments to her flight controls. She wasn't brave. Brave meant overcoming fear. She simply wasn't afraid. Fear wasn't relevant to the math. The math said the exhaust ports were invulnerable from any external approach angle. The math also said there was one angle that wasn't external. She pulled up her tactical display, overlaying internal schematics onto her sensor feed. The Dreadnought's fighter launch bay, a massive opening in the ventral hull currently cycling through combat launch operations. Dominion fighters were streaming out in waves, presumably to chase down the retreating coalition ships. The launch bay connected to the main hangar. The main hangar ran adjacent to the reactor housing, and the reactor housing. Luna traced the path, through the launch bay, through the hangar, through a maintenance corridor that was exactly wide enough for a human fighter if the pilot didn't mind losing both wingtips. Then a hard turn, 90 degrees at combat speed, into the reactor exhaust manifold. one shot. Direct line to the thermal exhaust port, from the inside. She ran the numbers. Speed required. Maximum sustainable thrust. Timing window. Approximately 1.3 seconds between the hangar doors cycling and the maintenance corridor blast shields activating. Margin for error. None. Her fighter's computer flagged the flight path as suicide, do not attempt. Luna disabled the warning. At rally point 7, Veth'nar was still watching. He'd told himself he was monitoring the tactical situation, gathering intelligence on Dominion response patterns, professional curiosity about an unusual engagement. He was lying to himself. Commander, his communications officer, said, "We're receiving a transmission from Starflare 1. She's broadcasting on Coalition emergency frequency." "Put it through." Luna's voice filled the bridge, still calm, still flat, as if she were ordering lunch rather than flying across the surface of a hostile dreadnought. "Coalition Command, this is Starflare. I've identified a target. Executing attack run." Veth'nar leaned forward. "Starflare, what target?" "There are no viable targets on a dreadnought for a single fighter." "Negative, Commander. Thermal exhaust port on the reactor housing. Shielded from external fire, but accessible through the main hangar bay." Silence on the bridge. Vethnar's tactical officer was already pulling up schematics, running the same calculations Luna had run. "That's impossible," the officer said. "The approach angle doesn't exist. The timing window is less than 2 seconds. The corridor width requires." She stopped, mandibles clicking with disbelief. "Commander, she's planning to fly through the ship." Veth'nar opened the channel again. "Starflare, the firing solution doesn't exist. You cannot physically execute that attack run." "Negative, Commander." Luna's voice didn't waver. "The solution exists. You just have to be in the right place at the right time. You'll die." "Maybe." A brief pause. Veth'nar could hear the whisper of her breathing, slow and steady. "But that dreadnought won't be killing any refugees today. Starflare out." The channel went silent. On the long-range display, Veth'nar watched the blue signature change course, diving toward the dreadnought's ventral hull, toward the fighter launch bay, toward the stream of enemy craft pouring out of the opening. She was flying against the current, into the launch path, through the door that enemy fighters were using to exit. "Humans don't fight by committee," Veth'nar said quietly, to no one in particular. "They fight by instinct, honed into something that looks like insanity from the outside." His tactical officer looked at him. "Sir?" "Nothing." He couldn't look away from the display. "Just something I'm beginning to understand." Luna hit the launch bay entrance at 300 meters per second. Dominion fighters scattered, their pilots screaming warnings over combat channels as a human craft shot past them going the wrong direction. Luna threaded between 2 interceptors with centimeters to spare, her wingtips close enough to see the shocked faces of enemy pilots through their canopies. The hangar opened before her, vast, cluttered with equipment and personnel, and more fighters preparing for launch. She didn't slow down. Her fighter screamed through the space at a height of 4 meters, close enough that deck crews dove for cover. Alarms erupted throughout the bay. Emergency bulkheads began cycling, too slow, far too slow for something moving at her velocity. The maintenance corridor appeared on her left, exactly where the schematics said it would be, exactly as narrow as she'd calculated. Luna rolled her fighter 90 degrees, presenting her narrowest profile, and shot into the passage. Metal screamed against metal as her wingtips scraped the corridor walls. Sparks exploded across her canopy, warning lights flooded her cockpit. She was inside the dreadnought. Alarm klaxons screamed through the inevitable victory. On the bridge, Supreme Commander Veth'nar stared at his internal sensor display with an expression his subordinates had never seen before. Disbelief. Complete, absolute disbelief. "Report," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Commander, we have an intrusion in Sector 7. His tactical officer's claws were trembling. A human fighter It has entered the ship through the main launch bay. Entered the ship. Yes, Commander. It is currently moving through Maintenance Corridor 77 Alpha at approximately 200 meters per second. Veth'nar processed this information. In his 40 years of service, he had never heard of such a thing. Ships fought ships. Fighters fought fighters. No one flew inside an enemy vessel. The concept wasn't just tactically insane. It was architecturally impossible. Corridors weren't designed for combat craft. The spaces were too narrow, the turns too sharp, the obstacles too numerous. "Destroy it," he ordered. "We're trying, Commander. Internal defense turrets are activating, but—" The officer stopped watching his display. She's already past them. By the time the targeting systems activate, she's moved beyond their firing arc. "Close the bulkheads. Seal her in." Emergency bulkheads are cycling, but— Another pause. Another moment of disbelief. "Commander!" "She's faster than our response time. The bulkheads aren't closing quickly enough." The Dominion had never seen a pilot fly through their ship. Because no sane species would try, Luna's world had compressed to pure geometry. The corridor was a tunnel of gray metal and flashing emergency lights. Obstacles appeared in her path. Support struts, junction boxes, a maintenance drone that exploded against her forward shields, and she processed each one without conscious thought. Roll, dive, climb, adjust. Her breathing was steady. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. In her mind, she wasn't in a Dominion Dreadnought. She was in the simulator back on Earth, running the canyon course on Europa's frozen moon. The one that killed simulated pilots so regularly that cadets called it the graveyard. The one where the walls were ice and the turns were tighter, and the margin for error was measured in centimeters. She'd run that course 417 times. She'd survived it 417 times. This wasn't harder than training. This was what training was for. A bulkhead began closing ahead of her, massive blast doors, cycling shut to seal the corridor. Luna calculated the gap, calculated her speed, calculated the timing down to hundredths of a second. She shot through with 30 centimeters to spare on either side. The bulkhead slammed shut behind her, close enough that she heard metal scrape against her rear stabilizers. Internal defense turrets activated along the corridor walls, their targeting systems spinning up with lethal intent. Luna was past them before they could fire. The shots meant for her sparked harmlessly against the corridor she'd already left behind. Dominion crew members dove for cover as she screamed past. Engineers, technicians, soldiers who had never expected to see combat inside their own ship. She caught glimpses of faces frozen in shock, mandibles open, eyes wide. She didn't slow down. The reactor housing was ahead. She could feel it before she saw it. A change in the corridor's geometry, the walls widening slightly to accommodate the massive power systems that drove the Dreadnought. Heat signatures spiked on her sensors. The thermal exhaust manifold was close. Turn coming, the hard one, 90 degrees at combat speed. Luna's hands tightened on her controls. This was the moment, the one she'd calculated, planned for, known was coming since she'd first seen the schematics. The turn was impossible. Her fighter wasn't designed for 90-degree course changes at 200 meters per second. The G-forces alone should tear the craft apart. The physics didn't support survival. But Luna had learned a long time ago that physics was negotiable if you were willing to pay the price. She hit the maneuvering thrusters at full power, simultaneously cutting her main engines and firing attitude jets in a pattern that her flight computer insisted was, quote, fatal error. Her fighter screamed, metal stress warnings, structural integrity warnings, every system telling her she was about to die. She made the turn. The G-forces slammed her into her seat. her vision graying at the edges despite her pressure suit's best efforts. Something in her fighter's frame groaned, a sound that meant she'd pushed the craft beyond its design limits. She didn't care. She was through. The exhaust manifold opened before her, a tunnel of heat and energy, glowing with the waste output of a reactor powerful enough to destroy cities. At the end, barely visible through the thermal distortion, was the exhaust port itself. Open, unshielded, exposed. One shot, no room for error. Luna's finger rested on the trigger. Her targeting computer painted the solution, a clean line from her current position to the port. The shot was possible. The shot was there. She wasn't thinking about the 40,000 refugees, wasn't thinking about Commander Veth'nar or the Coalition or Earth Defense directives, wasn't thinking about whether she'd survive the next 10 seconds. She was thinking about the target, only the target. Her breathing steadied. The world slowed. Time stretched into something infinite and precise. On target, she said quietly, to no one but herself. Firing. Her thumb pressed the trigger. 2 proton torpedoes launched from her fighter, streaking down the exhaust manifold at velocities that turned them into blue-white blurs. They entered the thermal exhaust port, penetrated the reactor housing, and found the main power core of the inevitable victory. Luna was already moving, slamming her throttle forward, racing toward the exit corridor she'd identified on her approach. Behind her, she felt more than heard the first rumble of something catastrophic beginning. The reactor didn't explode. Not yet. But it was dying. And she needed to be somewhere else when it finished. At Rally Point 7, the bridge of the harmonious consensus had gone completely silent. Every officer stood frozen at their station, eyes fixed on the long-range sensor display. Fleet Commander Veth'nar had stopped breathing without realizing it, his entire being focused on the distant signatures that told an impossible story. The Dreadnought's reactor signature was fluctuating. "Commander," his sensor officer whispered, as if speaking too loudly might change what they were seeing. "I'm reading cascade failures in the inevitable victory's primary power systems. Thermal containment is—" "Commander, thermal containment is collapsing." Veth'nar didn't respond. He couldn't look away. The blue signature, Starflare 1, was still moving, still inside the Dreadnought, racing through internal corridors that should have become a tomb. Luna was trying to escape a dying ship. Then she emerged. The sensor display showed her fighter erupting from an auxiliary port on the Dreadnought's starboard side, trailing sparks and debris in what looked like half her port wing. Her signature was weak, her power systems barely functional. But she was out. "Coalition Command, this is Starflare." Her voice came through the emergency channel, still calm, still flat, still utterly professional. "Target destroyed. Returning to station." Behind her, the inevitable victory began to die. The Dreadnought didn't explode dramatically. It didn't erupt in a single massive fireball like the entertainment vids showed. It died the way ships actually died, in pieces, in stages, in a cascade of failures that turned 3 kilometers of advanced warship into an expanding cloud of debris. First, the secondary power conduits overloaded. Explosions rippled across the hull like blisters bursting, venting atmosphere and flame into the vacuum. Then, the structural supports began to fail, the Dreadnought's spine twisting as internal forces tore at framework that had held steady for 60 years of service. The main reactor went critical 17 seconds after Luna's torpedoes found their mark. The resulting explosion was visible across half the system, a brief new star that outshone the local sun for a fraction of a second before collapsing into superheated plasma and shrapnel. The shockwave scattered the Dreadnought's remains across 1,000 kilometers of space, turning the pride of the Dominion fleet into a navigation hazard. One fighter, one pilot, one impossible shot. The inevitable victory was gone. On the bridge of the Dominion cruiser Righteous Purpose, Fleet Captain Veth'nar watched his flagship disintegrate and felt something he had never experienced in 30 years of conquest. Fear. Not concern, not tactical reassessment, pure cold fear. "Report," he managed, his voice steadier than he felt. "What happened?" "A human fighter, Fleet Captain." His tactical officer's voice was hollow. "A single human fighter penetrated our flagship's defenses, flew through the internal structure, and destroyed the main reactor." "That's not possible." "No, Fleet Captain, it is not." The officer looked up, his eyes wide. "And yet, the inevitable victory is debris." Veth'nar stared at the expanding cloud that had been his flagship. He thought about the coalition fleet they had come to destroy. He thought about the refugee convoy they had planned to capture. He thought about the 47 ships that should have been easy prey. One of those ships had carried a human pilot who had just done the impossible. How many more humans were in that fleet? "All ships," Veth'nar said, the words tasting like ash, "execute emergency withdrawal. Jump to rally point Theta." Immediately. Around him, his bridge crew moved to obey. No one questioned the order. No one suggested staying to complete the mission. They had just watched a Dreadnought, a ship that should have been invulnerable, die at the hands of a single fighter. The mathematics had changed. The Dominion fleet began to jump away, 72 ships fleeing the engagement zone in ragged sequence. They left behind the debris of their flagship, the convoy they had come to capture, and a small human fighter limping through space on damaged engines. They left behind the first defeat the Dominion had suffered in 17 years. Veth'nar watched the Dominion signatures vanish from his display, one by one, until the engagement zone was empty except for debris, the refugee convoy, and Starflare 1. "They're retreating," his tactical officer said, disbelief coloring her voice. "The entire Dominion fleet is retreating." "Yes." Veth'nar's voice was distant. "They are." He looked at the refugee convoy's signatures. 40,000 people in outdated transports, completely defenseless, still exactly where they had been when he'd ordered the retreat, still alive. "We retreated," he thought. She didn't. And 40,000 people are alive because of that choice. "Commander," his communications officer's voice was hesitant. "The human carrier Defiant is requesting permission to dispatch recovery craft for Starflare 1. Her fighter is badly damaged. They're not sure she can make it back on her own power." "Granted," Veth'nar paused, "and open a channel to Starflare 1, direct." "Yes, Commander." The channel crackled, and Luna's voice came through once more. The same voice he'd heard defying his orders, the same flat calm that had announced her impossible attack run. "Starflare here, Coalition Command." Veth'nar found himself struggling for words. What did you say to someone who had just done what she had done? His training covered tactical communications, diplomatic protocols, command structures. It did not cover this. "Squadron Commander Starflare," he said finally. "The Dominion fleet has withdrawn. The convoy is secure." "Copy. Coalition Command. Good to hear." No celebration, no triumph, no satisfaction. Just acknowledgement of information received. "Your fighter's status?" "Hull integrity at 60%. Port engine offline. Weapon systems depleted." A brief pause. "I could use a tow, Commander." "Recovery craft are en route." Veth'nar hesitated. "Starflare, Luna, what you did." "What I did was my job, Commander." Her voice remained level. "The convoy was in danger. I had a solution. I executed it." "You disobeyed a direct order from Coalition Command." "Yes, sir, I did." "You flew through the inside of an enemy dreadnought." "That's correct, sir." "You destroyed a ship that outgunned our entire fleet." "The reactor had a vulnerability, Commander. I exploited it." Another pause, and for just a moment, Something almost human crept into her voice. Honestly, the hard part was the 90-degree turn. The shot itself was straightforward. Veth'nar made a sound that might have been a laugh if Thessians laughed. Straightforward. Relatively speaking, sir. Silence on the channel. Veth'nar looked at the tactical display. The debris field that had been the inevitable victory, the refugee convoy still intact, the single damaged fighter drifting toward rescue. Starflare, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Sir? I told you your fighters were not relevant to this engagement. I was wrong. Permission to speak freely, Commander? Granted. You weren't wrong about the math. One fighter against a Dreadnought. The odds were exactly what you said they were. You made the right call with the information you had. And yet, you disobeyed. Yes, sir. Luna's voice was matter-of-fact. Because sometimes the math isn't the point. Sometimes you stay not because you can win, but because someone has to try. Veth'nar considered this. It ran counter to everything the Thessian collective believed about warfare. Decisions based on probability. Actions guided by consensus. Never committing to engagements where the mathematics didn't favor success. The humans apparently operated differently. Your recovery craft is approaching, Veth'nar said. We'll debrief when you're back aboard the Defiant. Understood, Commander. Starflare out. The channel closed, and Veth'nar stood alone on his bridge, surrounded by officers who had witnessed the impossible. One fighter, one pilot, one impossible shot. He thought about the refugees, 40,000 Kethrani civilians who would wake tomorrow in the same transports they'd gone to sleep in, alive because a human pilot had refused to do math the way Thessians did. He thought about Admiral Kethvar, who had authorized the abandonment of her own people, and what he would say to her when he delivered the news that her people had been saved after all. He thought about the Dominion fleet, 72 ships fleeing from a single engagement for the first time in nearly 2 decades. And he thought about Luna Starflare, drifting through space in a damaged fighter, calmly requesting a tow as if she hadn't just changed the course of the war. The Dreadnought had died. Not slowly, not dramatically. It had simply stopped being a threat. Because one human had decided that retreat wasn't an option. The ESS Defiant was smaller than Veth'nar had expected. He'd seen the human carrier on tactical displays, of course. Known its dimensions, its crew complement, its fighter capacity. But standing in its docking bay, surrounded by the cramped efficiency of human engineering, he felt the difference between data and experience. Humans built small. They built tight. They built as if every cubic meter of space was precious. Because for a species that had clawed its way off a single planet barely 2 centuries ago, it was. Commander Veth'nar. Captain Chen met him at the airlock, her expression professionally neutral. Welcome aboard the Defiant. Captain. Veth'nar inclined his head. I'm here to speak with Squadron Commander Starflare. She's in the maintenance bay. Post-flight assessment. Chen's eyes revealed nothing, but something in her posture suggested she was prepared to defend her pilot. I should mention, Commander, that from Earth Defense Command's perspective, Luna acted within the bounds of Directive 7. I'm aware of your directive, Captain. I'm not here to arrest her. Chen studied him for a moment, then nodded. This way. She led him through corridors that felt claustrophobic after the spacious halls of Thessian vessels. Crew members pressed against walls to let them pass, their eyes tracking Veth'nar with curiosity rather than fear. He noticed the wear on the bulkheads, the patches where repairs had been made, and made again. The evidence of a ship that had been pushed hard and maintained harder. The maintenance bay was louder than he'd expected. Human technicians swarmed around Luna's fighter, which rested on emergency landing struts in the center of the space. The craft looked like it had been through a shredder, hull scorched, port wing mangled, entire sections of armor plating simply gone. How did that thing survive re-entry into normal space? Veth'nar asked. Willpower, mostly. Chen's voice carried a hint of dry humor. And about 30 meters of emergency hull sealant. Veth'nar approached the fighter slowly, taking in the damage, scorch marks from point defense fire. Deep gouges from the corridor walls inside the Dreadnought, stress fractures along the frame from maneuvers that should have torn the craft apart. And there, beneath the ruined port wing, was Luna Starflare. She wasn't celebrating, wasn't accepting congratulations from her fellow pilots. She was lying on a maintenance creeper half underneath her fighter, running diagnostic checks on the landing gear assembly. Squadron Commander, Veth'nar said. Luna slid out from under the fighter, her flight suit stained with coolant and hydraulic fluid. She looked up at him with the same calm expression he'd seen on his sensor displays, tired, focused, completely without pretense. Commander Veth'nar. She stood, wiping her hands on a rag. Didn't expect you to come in person. I felt this conversation required more than a communication channel. Luna nodded, as if this were perfectly reasonable. Give me a moment, she turned to one of the technicians. Martinez, the starboard thruster housing is cracked. It held for the return flight, but it needs replacement before she flies again. Copy that, Commander. Luna turned back to Veth'nar, tucking the rag into her belt. There's a briefing room down the corridor, more private. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't proud. She was just done. Veth'nar followed her to a small compartment barely large enough for a table and 4 chairs. Human scale. Everything on this ship was human scale, and it made him feel oversized, awkward, out of place. Luna sat, gesturing for him to do the same. She didn't speak first. She simply waited, her hands folded on the table, her breathing slow and even. You disobeyed a direct order, Veth'nar said finally. Yes, Commander, I did. Coalition Command Authority supersedes individual species directives during joint operations. You were legally bound to follow my orders. Yes, Commander. You could have died. Your attack should have been impossible. By every tactical calculation, you should be debris scattered across the inevitable victory's remains. Luna considered this. The odds weren't good, she agreed. But the alternative was 40,000 dead civilians. That math was simpler. Simpler, Veth'nar leaned forward. Squadron Commander, I have been trying to understand your decision since you broke formation. I have consulted tactical databases, psychological profiles, human cultural analyses. None of it explains what you did. What specifically are you trying to understand, Commander? Why you stayed? The words came out harsher than he intended. We fight by consensus. We calculate acceptable losses. We make decisions based on probability of success and preservation of strategic assets. He stopped, struggling to articulate what he'd witnessed. You ignored all of it. You flew a suicide mission based on what? Instinct? Emotion? Luna was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was patient, as if explaining something to a student. Commander, you calculated what you could afford to lose. Your fleet, your ships, your strategic position. You ran the numbers, and the numbers said retreat. The numbers were correct. They were, Luna nodded, but I wasn't calculating what I could afford to lose. I was calculating what I couldn't accept losing. 40,000 civilians, families, children. She met his eyes. That number doesn't go into my equation as a variable, Commander. It goes in as a constant. Unacceptable. Non-negotiable. Even at the cost of your own life? My life is 1. Theirs were 40,000. Luna shrugged slightly. I wasn't trying to be a hero, Commander. I wasn't trying to prove anything about humans or make some grand gesture. I just couldn't leave them. Someone had to stay. You could have failed. You almost certainly should have failed. Yes. And then you would have died for nothing. No. Luna's voice was firm. I would have died trying. That's not nothing. That's not nothing at all. Veth'nar sat back, Processing. The Thessian Collective had spent 10,000 years building a civilization based on consensus, calculation, the careful weighing of costs and benefits. It was how they'd survived, how they'd prospered, how they'd become one of the galaxy's great powers. And here was a human, a species that had barely left their home system, telling him that some things couldn't be calculated, that some costs were simply unacceptable, regardless of probability. "You asked me to do math," Luna said quietly. "I did math, just a different equation. You calculated, can we win? I calculated, can I live with leaving? Different questions. Same answer for me. I couldn't leave. Your answer defied military logic." "My answer kept 40,000 people alive." Luna's eyes held his. "Commander, I respect the Thessian Collective. I respect your experience, your wisdom, your methods. But humans learned a long time ago that some things matter more than winning. Sometimes you fight because the alternative is becoming something you can't live with. Even if you die." "Even then," Luna stood, moving to the small viewport that looked out on the docking bay. "There's a phrase we have on Earth, no one left behind. Most species think it's sentiment. Wishful thinking. Something we say to make ourselves feel better about impossible situations." She turned back to face him. "It's not sentiment, Commander. It's doctrine. It's who we are. We don't leave people behind because if we did, we wouldn't be worth saving ourselves." Veth'nar rose slowly, his mind churning with implications he wasn't sure he fully grasped. The Thessian in him wanted to argue, to point out the logical flaws in her reasoning, the mathematical certainty that her approach would eventually result in catastrophic losses. But the inevitable victory was debris. 40,000 refugees were alive. And a single human pilot was standing in front of him, not asking for praise or forgiveness, just stating facts about who she was and what she believed. "I don't know how to report this to Coalition Command," he admitted. "Report the truth, Commander. I disobeyed orders. I destroyed a Dreadnought." The convoy survived. Luna's expression softened slightly, the first hint of anything beyond professional calm. "If they want to court-martial me, that's their right. I knew the consequences when I broke formation." "You would accept punishment? After what you accomplished?" "Accomplishment doesn't change the fact that I disobeyed. The rules exist for reasons," she paused. "But if I had to do it again, I would. Every time. Some rules matter less than people." Veth'nar moved toward the door, then stopped. "Squadron Commander Starflare." "Yes, Commander?" "The next time we deploy together," he hesitated, unsure how to phrase what he wanted to say, "I will factor your philosophy into my tactical calculations." Luna almost smiled. Almost. "Understood, Commander." "You are a deeply confusing species." "We get that a lot, sir." Veth'nar left the briefing room, left the Defiant, and returned to his own ship with more questions than answers. He had come expecting arrogance, defiance, the human bravado he'd read about in cultural assessments. Instead, he'd found a tired pilot who had simply refused to abandon strangers, and who couldn't understand why that was strange. Fleet Commander Veth'nar stared at the blank report template for 17 minutes before writing the first word. The Thessian Collective had precise formats for after-action reports, objective assessments of tactical decisions, clear documentation of successes and failures, recommendations for future operations based on lessons learned. Nothing in the format accounted for what had happened at the Kethrani convoy. He began typing. Coalition Defense Initiative. After-action report. Kethrani convoy engagement. Classification. Priority distribution. Commanding officer. Fleet Commander Veth'nar. Thessian Collective Navy. Date. Galactic Standard. 7742.156. Engagement duration. 23 minutes. Outcome. Coalition tactical victory. Refugee convoy preserved. Enemy flagship destroyed. Summary of events. Coalition Defense Fleet engaged Dominion hegemony forces in defense of Kitharani refugee convoy. 40,000 plus civilians. Enemy forces numbered 73 combat vessels, including one Dreadnought-class flagship. Inevitable victory. Coalition forces numbered 47 vessels across 6 species contingents. Initial engagement proved unfavorable. Coalition consensus determined tactical withdrawal necessary to preserve fleet assets. All species commanders concurred. Withdrawal order issued at engagement minute 11. Human Squadron Commander Luna Starflare, callsign Starflare, refused withdrawal order, citing Earth Defense Directive 7 regarding protection of civilian lives. Squadron Commander Starflare subsequently penetrated Dominion Dreadnought point defense perimeter, solo approach, entered enemy vessel through fighter launch bay, navigated internal corridors at combat speed, destroyed main reactor via thermal exhaust port vulnerability, escaped vessel prior to reactor breach, enemy flagship inevitable victory destroyed. Remaining Dominion forces withdrew from engagement zone. Refugee convoy intact. 0 civilian casualties. Assessment of Squadron Commander Starflare's actions. Technically, Squadron Commander Starflare committed insubordination under Coalition command protocols. She disobeyed a direct order from the commanding officer during combat operations. Practically, her actions resulted in preservation of 40,000 plus civilian lives, destruction of enemy flagship, complete enemy withdrawal, strategic victory from tactical defeat. Recommendation: no disciplinary action. Human tactical doctrine differs from Coalition standard in ways this commander did not fully appreciate prior to this engagement. Earth Defense Directive 7 appears to supersede Coalition authority in situations involving civilian protection. More significantly, human pilots appear to operate under psychological and philosophical frameworks that do not align with consensus-based decision-making. This is not a criticism, it is an observation. Squadron Commander Starflare did not disobey orders out of arrogance or disregard for command structure. She disobeyed because her species calculates acceptable losses differently than ours. Where Thessians ask, what can we afford to lose, humans appear to ask, what can we not accept losing? The mathematics are the same, the variables are different. Addendum, personal observation. The humans have a phrase, no one left behind. Prior to this engagement, I interpreted this as sentiment. Emotional rhetoric, typical of a young species still attached to concepts that older civilizations have learned to temper with pragmatism. I was wrong. It is not sentiment, it is doctrine. It is fundamental to how humans understand their obligations to one another and, apparently, to anyone under their protection. Squadron Commander Starflare was not the best pilot in the Coalition fleet. Her skills, while exceptional, are matched by pilots from several other species. But she was the one who wouldn't leave. I am beginning to believe that distinction matters more than I previously understood. Submitted by Fleet Commander Veth'nar, Thessian Collective Navy, Coalition Defense Initiative. Veth'nar transmitted the report and sat back in his chair. The official record was complete. But he knew, even as he filed it, that the official record wasn't the report that would matter. The unofficial report spread faster than any transmission. It traveled through pilot-ready rooms and engineering bays, through officers' quarters and enlisted mess halls. It crossed species barriers and language differences, carried by the universal currency of spacefaring crews everywhere, a story too incredible not to share. Did you hear what happened at the Kitharani convoy? A human pilot killed a dreadnought, by herself. She flew through the ship. Inside it, through the corridors. One fighter, one pilot, one shot. The details grew with each telling, as stories do, but the core remained constant. because the Corps was already unbelievable enough without embellishment. A human had been ordered to retreat. She had refused. She had done the impossible. And 40,000 people were alive because of it. On the Volari destroyer Swift Current, a young pilot named Cathara submitted a transfer request to the human carrier Defiant. Her commanding officer asked why. "I want to learn," she said. "I want to understand how they think." She was the first. She was not the last. Within a week, Coalition Command had received 47 transfer requests from pilots across all species contingents. All wanted assignment to human squadrons. All cited the same reason, in different words. They wanted to learn what made humans fly the way they did. Coalition tactical assessments were updated. The entry for human fighter squadrons was revised from its original classification. Tilde human fighter assets, support role, limited tactical value in fleet engagements, expendable in high-threat scenarios, The new entry read, human fighter assets, force multipliers, capable of independent action beyond standard tactical parameters. Do not assume standard probability calculations apply. Recommend deployment in scenarios requiring unconventional solutions or high-risk defensive operations. A footnote was added, authored by Fleet Commander Veth'nar. Human pilots should not be considered expendable assets under any circumstances. They do not consider themselves expendable, and they will not act as if they are. Plan accordingly. On the ESS Defiant, Luna Starflare slept. Her quarters were small, barely enough room for a bunk, a locker, and a fold-down desk. The walls were covered with mission patches, photos of her squadron, a single image of a blue-green planet that most humans kept somewhere in their living space. She slept without dreaming. No nightmares about the corridors of the inevitable victory. No cold sweats about the moment when her fighter had scraped through passages too narrow for safety. No lingering terror about the seconds when the reactor had begun to fail and she'd been racing for an exit that might not exist. Just sleep. Deep, dreamless, the sleep of someone who had done their job and could rest now. Her squadron had tried to celebrate. She'd allowed them one drink in the mess hall, accepted their congratulations with quiet grace, and then excused herself to run post-flight diagnostics on her backup systems. They understood. They'd flown with her long enough to know that Luna Starflare didn't process things through celebration. She processed them through routine. Through the careful, methodical work of preparing for the next mission. There would always be a next mission. 3 days later, Veth'nar stood in the Coalition Command briefing room, reviewing the roster for their next operation. A Thessian diplomatic convoy required escort through contested space, moderate threat level, standard defensive deployment. He scanned the asset list: Thessian cruisers, Volari destroyers, Catharani support ships. And there, at the bottom, ESS Defiant, Fighter Complement 12, Squadron Commander L. Starflare. Veth'nar felt something unexpected move through him. It took a moment to identify. Relief. If it goes wrong, he thought, she'll stay. It was a strange comfort, knowing that somewhere in his fleet was a pilot who wouldn't retreat, who would calculate the situation differently than he would, who might disobey his orders if she believed those orders would cost innocent lives. A week ago, that thought would have troubled him. The Thessian collective valued consensus, obedience, the subordination of individual judgment to collective wisdom. Now he understood something his training had never taught him. Sometimes you needed someone who wouldn't follow orders. Sometimes you needed someone who would look at impossible odds and find a way through anyway. Sometimes the most valuable asset in your fleet wasn't the biggest ship or the strongest weapons. Sometimes it was a tired pilot and a damaged fighter who simply refused to leave people behind. The briefing began. Officers from 6 species filled the room, their attention focused on the tactical display. Veth'nar outlined the mission parameters, the threat assessments, the contingency plans. When he reached the section on fighter support, he paused. "Human squadron will fly forward reconnaissance," he said. "Squadron Commander Starflare will have tactical discretion within engagement parameters." His tactical officer looked up, surprised. Tactical discretion wasn't standard protocol for fighter squadrons. It meant trusting the squadron commander to make independent decisions without constant oversight. Veth'nar met her eyes calmly. "The humans have earned a degree of operational flexibility. Their methods are unconventional, but effective." No one argued. The briefing continued, and Veth'nar found his gaze drifting to the roster display. Starflare, 12 fighters, 1 small carrier at the edge of the formation. Fleet Command had updated their records that day. Human fighter squadrons were no longer listed as support assets. They were listed as last resort. Because humans were what you called when retreat wasn't an option. And somehow, against all logic, against all probability, against everything the mathematics said should be true, that made Veth'nar feel safer than any Dreadnought ever had.